Küçeden peri geler sallana sallanar. Küçeden peri geler sallana sallanar. Aşığının könlünü alar, geler nazlana nazlanar. Aşığının könlünü alar, geler nazlana nazlanar. Senin yüzün bir yana, benim yüzüm bir yana, senin yüzün bir yana, benim yüzüm bir yana. Eşkinin dağları uçtum, izledim yana yana. Eşkin dağlarını uçtum, izledim yana yana. Kara göz vay vay vay, kara göz vay vay vay, kara göz vay vay vay, kara göz vay. Cemali hoş gelin geler nazlana nazlana. Cemali hoş gelin geler hoş paraflana. Aşığının könlünü alar, geler nazlana nazlana. Aşığının könlünü alar, geler nazlana nazlana. Senin yüzün bir yana, benim yüzüm bir yana. Senin yüzün bir yana, benim yüzüm bir yana. Eşkin dağlarını uçtum, izledim yana yana. Eşkin dağlarını uçtum, izledim yana yana. Kara göz vay vay vay, kara göz vay vay vay, kara göz vay vay vay, kara göz vay, kara göz vay vay. Thank you. These were a few tunes in memory of Frank McCloskey, who admired the world cultures, who attended many diverse musical genres in our town and other places. He always came to the Central Asian Silk Road festivals and sometimes addressed the public. And we will be missing him, but he will be always in our memory. Thank you for coming out. Thank you, Hakan Töker, on piano.
Thank you very much. The other night, Roberta McCloskey requested this next tune that we're going to play. Morning Has Broken. It's a beautiful traditional Irish melody that was made famous by Cat Stevens. And then we'll continue with some traditional Irish jigs. This is Jamie Gans on the fiddle, Mike Casey on the guitar, and I'm Gray Larson. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll do one more quick medley of Irish traditional tunes for you and then move on to the next part of the program. The first tune is called The Bird in the Tree or The Bird in the Bush, whichever you prefer. And then the Dublin Reel, followed by
The Earl's Chair.
The Earl's Chair. There we go. Thank you.
I'm John Goss, and I had the unique privilege to work with Frank McCloskey for over 10 years, and I am honored to be your MC today. It's totally appropriate that we gather here on Kirkwood Avenue, just inside of the courthouse in downtown. It's a great symbol, I think, of the accomplishments of Frank McCloskey's years as mayor. This revitalization downtown spread all over the city and really transformed Bloomington into the great city that it is today. I want to give a special thanks to Mayor John Fernandez and his staff and Buzz Kirk Chumley for helping us with the arrangements for the theater. Also, thanks for the great gourmet food and beverages from the Uptown and from Grazzi's. And I want to thank Mr. Copy for the programs with that great picture of Frank that was taken just last fall, which you have on your program. Why are we here today? Because we all admire, respect, and love a man who made a tremendous positive contribution to all our lives. We have friends here from all over the country. We have folks from Washington, D.C., from the State House in Indianapolis, elected officials from around Indiana. I'm not going to be able to recognize everyone individually. We just want to thank you all for being here. There are so many of us here who were inspired, personally inspired, and given a chance and given encouragement to get involved in government. And I'd just like to ask for all of the folks who are here, who were members of the McCloskey team, as governmental staffers, as campaign workers, could you just stand up for a second? There's a lot of people here. And I know everyone else was on the McCloskey team too, and that's why you're here. Frank was a great thinker. And I learned very early in my days of working with Frank that he liked to start out the day reading the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and all those things before he took a look at what might be happening in his daily schedule. And I think that some of that came from influences in his personal studies and readings. And Bill Breeden, who's the minister of the Bloomington Unitarian Universalist Church, is going to come up and talk a little about those influences on Frank. And I think some of you remember Bill as that close friend of John Poindexter, too.
I'm going to try to set a standard of being brief since I'm the first one up here. I just want to say that I met Frank for the first time in his office in Washington, D.C. when we were working on the nuclear freeze. And Frank was one of those congressmen that you didn't walk in and just sit with staffers. You walk in and talk to him. And I always respected that greatly. Another time, Frank called me on the night before I was to go to trial for the great kidnapping of and holding hostage of Mr. Poindexter's name. Frank called me and he said, Bill, you need to take their plea bargain. You really do. He said, I've been calling all weekend down there to try to get these guys to drop this and tell them, you know, you're the laughing stock of the nation. But he said, they're serious. If you get convicted as a felon, you're going to spend at least a year in prison. And he said, I've done all I can do for you. And I appreciated that. We did go to trial, and an 18-year-old kid on the jury saved my ass from going to prison. But, but Frank tried. Roberta came to see me the other day and brought with her some books of Frank's favorite thinkers, and I was not surprised really to learn that the three she brought were three of my favorite thinkers, Paul Tillich, Thomas Merton, and Reinhold Niebuhr. I just want to share with you briefly a few quotes from these people. Tillich says, the awareness of the ambiguity of one's highest achievements as well as one's deepest failures is a definite symptom of maturity. I found that in Frank McCloskey, that he realized even when he won that there was ambiguity involved, and even when he lost, which he did occasionally because he didn't listen to me enough, but even when he lost, there was ambiguity in that as well. It was part of the human condition. The first duty of love, says Paul Tillich, is to listen, and I've already indicated that Frank was a listener. There is no love which does not become help. There is no love that does not become help. And certainly Frank saw that when he saw the conditions in Bosnia and elsewhere. He turned his love into help. The biggest human temptation, says Merton, is to settle for too little. And Frank simply refused to do that. He constantly strove for more than he knew he could accomplish. Merton also said, freedom, absolute freedom. The freedom to say one's own yes and one's own no, and not merely echo the yeses and nos of church, state, society, or family, is essential to what it means to being a human being. And the lack of that freedom is the basic cause of most of the sickness of the world today. I think Frank was committed to that kind of freedom. He respected that kind of freedom. I always felt, even when Frank and I disagreed, as we did on many occasions, because he was more practical than I was probably, but I always felt he respected very much my freedom to say my own yes and my own no, and encouraged me to do so, as I think he did all people. Merton says the logic of worldly success rests on a fallacy, the strange error that our perfection depends on the thoughts and opinions and applause of other men. A weird life it is indeed to be living always in somebody else's imagination, as if that were the only place in which one could at last become real. Obviously, Frank took risk of being his own self. He refused to allow political realities to keep him from reaching out to the people in Bosnia, even though it probably cost him an election. He refused to allow just the success in other person's eyes to define who he was as a human being. The sad duty of politics, says Niebuhr, is to establish justice in a sinful world, and democracy is finding proximate solutions to insoluble problems. The final test of religious faith is whether it will enable men and or women. Niebuhr didn't say that, but I throw it in. The final test of religious faith is whether it will enable the human family to endure insecurity without complacency or despair, whether it can so interpret the ancient verities that they will not become mere escape hatches from responsibilities, but instruments of insights into what civilization means. I really think Frank was a much deeper thinker than most people gave him credit for. Politics tends to keep you on the surface of things. But I was amazed to find him, when Roberta brought the books in, to find him reading. I'm not to suggest that I'm a deep thinker. I don't mean to suggest that. I just to say that here was a man who's steeped in politics, who never forgot his spiritual roots, and who recognized that the spiritual reality in which we profess to believe has to be exemplified in the political realities for which we're willing to fight. I think if Frank were here today, and indeed he is here today in my thinking, he's among us, he's in us, his spirit is always here. And I think he will tell us it's time to put our spiritual realities on the line. That the fact is that just the applause of men or just the worldly success of this affluence from which we all suffer in North America, this affluence that makes us ignore the world and a hurt that is hurting and suffering, this affluence that dulls our spirit, I think Frank would say to us, it's time to get beyond that. It's time to step out, reach out your hand to the rest of the world, as he did in a very unique way in Bosnia, reaching out to the Muslim community. We need to build fences, not walls. We need to build places for people to live, health care. We need to begin to cut away from this absurd belief that we can buy security with bombs, planes, and all the other things that we pay for. Because security will come when we believe in justice and we put ourselves to it. I think Frank lived with that. I think he struggled with the ambiguity of that, but I think his deep spiritual commitments made him who he was, and I'm honored to speak on his behalf today and say to you, work for peace, work for justice, because I believe the human community is worth saving. Thank you.
It's hard to follow that, but we're going to do it with video. Chris Sauter was Frank's very close advisor for many campaigns, put Frank's message out there and did a great job all those campaigns, and he also captured, I think, the real essence of Frank's life in this video.
Thanks, John. I'm Chris Sauter. I was, like almost everybody here, I was lucky enough to work on several of Frank's campaigns. And when it comes to Frank's campaign, luck is a word that often comes to mind. In 1995, after he left the Congress, a tribute dinner was organized for him, and I was asked to produce the video you're going to see in a few minutes. And Frank really didn't want to do it. He said, "Yeah, my career's not over. You know, I don't want my story told now." But as we got into it, I think he enjoyed it because it gave him an opportunity to create some kind of oral history, particularly as it relates to the early Bloomington years, which really were very important to him, and which Ted Najum will be talking about in a little more detail. So what you're going to see here is was originally just meant for sort of dinner entertainment about 10 years ago, but I think you're going to enjoy it because we tried to keep it mostly light. So whenever our people are ready, we will.
Was born in hard times, brought up by a single parent. He served his country in the Air Force and worked his way through school while raising a family.
I met Frank the day before I got out of the service, and I knew he was going to be a politician because he told me so, and they called him senator when he was in high school. So when we were married and the children were little and he came home and said that he was running for state rep, I wasn't surprised. I guess he was running because no one else would do it.
In 1970, I was the Democratic County Chairman in Monroe County, and we were trying to fill the ticket.
The goal was Harry Gonzo, the 68 Rose Bowl quarterback. Harry would make a great candidate, and Dave had 2 or 3 fallback positions on local lawyers.
A committee was appointed that consisted of Dave Rogers and myself to try to find somebody else to run for this seat.
So I said, well, Dave, I've always been interested in politics in the long run. I'll tell you what, if you can't get Gonzo or the other 2 or 3 people to file, could as a last fallback, could you consider filing me? He said, sure. In fact, sign these papers.
He handed me an envelope and he said, if nobody else will run, I've got my law clerk and we can run him till we figure out what to do.
Then about 5 to 7 days went by, and I'm clerking up at the law firm again. Dave's walking by, and I was somewhat reluctant or shy to ask. I said, Dave, remember I filed those forms. What's the situation? Is Gonzo filing? He says, oh, Lord, no, we filed you. Congratulations, you're the candidate. Your life has changed forever. You are now a public name. So he was so right, and that's the way it started. But I did not know I was filed as such. My life was in Dave Rogers' hands.
I don't think they've seen such a door-to-door effort especially in Monroe County and Lawrence County ever. And may have not since. So that when he ran for mayor, we had a lot of energy to work from.
We had a primary election in 1971 for mayor with Frank McCloskey and Tom Lemon.
It was a volatile time here in Bloomington as well as in the country. The Vietnam War was making political activists of many people who had not been active in politics before.
It obviously was a time of change with various national aspects affecting the local situation. One of them was that it was the first year of the 18-year-old vote. Secondarily, the Vietnam War was going on, and whether you were running for mayor, city council, or whatever, it invariably came up on campus appearances as to what is your stand on the war.
Clearly, the candidate of change, the candidate of the future, the person that everybody became excited about as we learned to know him was Frank.
I, in essence, knew it was over about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the exit reports with the national media and the networks, because they were interested because of the 18-year-old vote, were telling me that I was carrying the campus area precincts 17 to 3, 85%, with students backed up by the the hundreds.
The result of the election was that instead of a Republican mayor and 8 Republican city council members, we had a Democratic mayor and 8 Democratic city council members. We started right away to change things.
The McCloskey administration was the first modern administration in Bloomington history. There is no way to compare what the programs, the infrastructure, the capabilities were of the administration when I left vis-a-vis when we started out on it.
He came into a government that was not a modern government. There were the rudiments of a modern government. I mean, there was not even public records of where the water pipes were.
You can't look at Bloomington now without realizing that what it is and where it has come and where it is going was fundamentally shaped by Frank's terms as mayor. He did everything we take for granted, either when we drive through town or when we go to the park or when we talk about how government operates, really all have the seeds. Frank either did them or he planted those seeds way back then.
We created an environmental commission that became active.
Trash pickup. We didn't have city-run trash pickup when Frank came in as mayor.
We created a human rights ordinance.
Downtown revitalization. When Frank went into it, half of downtown was boarded up and the other half was headed that direction. Everybody thought you were crazy and couldn't do anything about it.
We did pay special attention to neighborhood revitalization.
We passed the leash law while Frank was mayor, and passing the leash law was a really big deal.
On a life or death basis, upgrading the ambulance service has to be one of the things closest to my heart.
Open government, more commissions, more citizens involved in things, almost to a fault if you're the city attorney, I might add, which I was for a while.
I don't think anyone who knows me well knows that I can get very reflective and appreciative to the point of possibly on a few occasions getting teary as to my feelings for Bloomington. But to me, it's always been the magic place where anything is possible, where good things happen, where people recognize you for what you are rather than what your position is. I think over the years, obviously, that continues. It is a very special place.
February 15th of 1982, I specifically remember calling Frank one morning after I'd learned Floyd Fithian was going to run for the U.S. Senate and told him he had to run for the 8th Congressional District.
Rich Bell called and said, Frank, this economy is getting bad under Reagan. You could and should be the Congress.
No one really gave Frank much of a chance to win. Joel Deckard clearly was the favorite in that race.
And it was getting tough. He was about in the polls where you would expect a new face.
Frank did start making some headway, especially through the unions and his labor contacts. It was still pretty clear that Deckard was going to win.
And I told Frank, I said, just keep going. Things happen. About a week or 10 days later, I swear to you, the incumbent congressman had an accident with an automobile under circumstances that were most unusual.
And he got a nasty cut on his forehead. And so every picture in the paper and newscast of poor Joel, people were reminded. I mean, I don't think anyone brought it up.
Frank didn't get involved in any of it. And basically that incumbent congressman just twisted in the wind until his negative points that he brought on himself really did make up close the gap, so to speak.
And I'll never forget these exact words, thinking to myself, good God, Joel, you've hit a tree. Now I'm going to be the congressman that the tree elected.
He's always known the district was a difficult district for him. I don't think he's ever taken that for granted. And has run some very tight races, some very close races.
In '84 was a historic contest between Frank and Rick McIntyre. And turned out to be a very, very close race.
Night after night, the recount commissioners in Indiana's 8th Congressional District broke open the precinct boxes and, like players in a weekly poker game, dealt the ballots for the ritual counting. Under the watchful eyes of candidates' aides, they laboriously fitted the punch card ballots designed for instant computer calculation over the coded color keys, red for the Democrat, green for the Republican, black for the Libertarian.
McCloskey 244, McIntyre 409, Fallahay zip, overvotes none, no votes 14, invalid 5.
When it's all over and done with, the winner will have more than a card game to his credit. He'll have a seat in the House of Representatives.
I'm going to get postpartum depression. I don't know.
This counting and recounting of ballots in Indiana's southwest corner started on Election Day, when the race between Democrat Frank McCloskey and Republican Richard McIntyre ended in a virtual tie. For the days and weeks after November 6, the results seesawed back and forth as spotty recounts gave first one candidate the lead, then the other. While the counting was still going on, Indiana's Republican Secretary of State, Edwin Simcox, certified his party's candidate the winner. The Democrat called that blatant partisanship.
Mr. Simcox showed in one instance after another that, it'd be a long time, regardless of results, before I ever got certified.
Then the fight moved to Washington.
According to the President, the Chair will swear in all members of the House at this time.
Mr. Speaker, I object to the oath being administered to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. McIntyre.
The House of Representatives, controlled by Democrats, decided to declare the Indiana congressional seat vacant. The Republican candidate called that blatant partisanship.
As far as we could tell by looking through the 196 years of precedent, there had been 81 other cases very similar to this, and in the 81 other instances, they had sworn in the certified winner. So we felt like it was a very partisan move. I think it kind of set the tone for the 99th Congress.
While the partisans wrangled, the recount went on, but each of the district's 15 counties applied different rules to the tallying. In the city of Evansville, a court order to strictly apply complicated voting procedures meant the invalidation of thousands of ballots, many of them in primarily black precincts.
I personally ask that you perhaps think about civil disobedience, because I noticed that you passed the buck and said that you were doing what the judge has asked you to do.
Sandra Matthews' protest is echoed by many other voters.
Personally, I take pride in voting, and I don't like the idea that my vote doesn't count,
Well, I think a lot of them better go back to school so they know how to make our votes count.
Bill Jackson is the editor of the Evansville Courier.
People have been calling us in some instances just to talk about it. They're so frustrated they don't know what to do about it, so they're just calling to talk. One person yesterday called. He's a handicapped individual who had been persuaded to go to the polls and vote, and now is very frustrated that his vote apparently, or is one of those in question, perhaps was thrown out.
Bill Jackson says the letters to the editor have been pouring in. I feel that instead of sending watchers to ensure free and fair elections to South America and Africa, those watchers should have been placed in our polls in the good old USA. We, the voters of Evansville, should demand the incompetent election workers to be prosecuted for vote fraud. This recount is turning into a farce. The totals will be disputed forever in litigation. May the best man with the best attorneys win. House Republicans are trying to make the race a national issue. They regularly use after-hours time in the House of Representatives to speak to the television audience.
There is now a serious effort underway in this House, led not by a radical faction or a rump group, but led by leaders of the Democratic Party, in effect, to steal a seat in the United States House of Representatives.
Republicans are using the drawn-out results of 1984 to shape voter attitudes for 1986. And when those Indiana voters go to the polls in 1986, guess what their choice is likely to be? Democrat McCloskey versus Republican McIntyre.
Recount? Anything's better than a recount. We survived that.
And one of the more colorful events, I guess there were several of the '86 campaign season, was the great catfish McBait at Shoals, Indiana.
And it was hot enough to fry fish on the sidewalk, as I recall. Frank and Rick McIntyre are out on the back of this flatbed truck debating, and as I recall, it was a pretty good debate.
It was obviously a feisty and a dynamic and an outdoor event. Maybe haven't seen the likes of it before or since.
When the race was still quite close and with about 3 weeks to go, McIntyre shows up in Bloomington, trots out a former couple police officers who say that they remembered Frank using hashish or something like that.
That was the first point at which public officials of our generation or political candidates were having to go around and being forced into the old, well, did you ever smoke any marijuana?
Frank caught me off guard the morning I talked to him because I didn't know what he would say when I called him with this allegation of having used or smoked marijuana. And Frank says, of course I did.
Yeah, Frank confronted that issue, and I think that he unhesitatingly said, yes, of course he smoked marijuana at some point, sometime, some instance. And McIntyre was very disappointed in the fact that it did not get any kind of a rise from the public, and in fact, I think the public appreciated his honesty and his straightforwardness with it.
Looking back on the 1986 race, in many ways, it may have been the most satisfying for Frank. The Republicans threw everything they had at him. They threw all their money. It was the #1 race in the country. It was the only congressional race that Ronald Reagan came to campaign in. Reagan, Bush, Gingrich, Dole all came in. And Frank won, and he won decisively. And I think he felt he finally got the monkey off his back, that he had won this race without the help of lawyers and without divine intervention.
What makes a job of congressman worth having isn't the title or the things that go with it. It's the feeling you get when you know you've made a difference, making someone's life a little better. Like stopping job cuts at Crane and its shelf-stable foods. Getting drought aid for our farmers. Like getting the ball rolling for a modern highway from Indianapolis to Evansville. That can really make a difference for Southwest Indiana. It's helping veterans get the new GI Bill of Rights. It's helping senior citizens get Social Security and health care. It's helping the handicapped get medical and educational benefits. Sometimes you get a note of thanks. Sometimes you get a handshake and a smile. I'm sincerely gratified when people say I'm making a difference.
The '88 cycle, I think, presented a scenario where Frank, for the first time, could focus on being the congressman.
You don't measure a congressman.
Put together a spot where I got to play the dubious bureaucrat from Washington, and Frank was the savior of all the trees in the forest.
Down much of the Hoosier National Forest, Frank McCloskey took the chainsaw out of their hands. McCloskey stopped them from destroying an Indiana tree.
You know, maybe they should try this on the deficit and leave our trees alone.
Congressman McCloskey, making a difference.
I think what has endeared Frank to the working people is the fact that he'll stop and listen and that he genuinely cares about what happens to us.
Frank McCloskey stopped this facility from being closed.
While dozens of military bases have closed their gates, casualties of America's victory in the Cold War, one remains strong. Thanks to Frank McCloskey's work, Crane Naval Base has become a high-tech center, helping America prepare for a new era and providing thousands of jobs for southwestern Indiana.
Congressman McCloskey has made the difference through his hard work and effort. Crane is still here today.
I've said it very few times, but there's people in life that we like to say it's good to have walked in their footstep or had their shadow cross their paths. And Congressman McCloskey, to me, as well as people, I'm a better person today with having known him. Thank God for the opportunity. serving the people.
Frank was always willing to do the things that we used to think we should do, but weren't sure we had the courage to do. And the Vietnam War had been just the beginning of that, but he ended on the Bosnian note, and in between, there was event after event where our political mind said, oh dear God, Frank, you're losing votes. But our conscience said, you're doing the right thing.
He's been called the conscience of the House of Representatives because he challenged the president and leaders of his own party on a matter of principle.
And he took on some very big figures in this town and went head to head with them, including the Secretary of State.
Somebody who has the integrity to pursue an issue like that in spite of the odds and in spite of the fact that he has nothing to gain from it personally is incredibly rare in politics.
He argued his position with tenacity. He made an extraordinary number of trips to Bosnia. I don't really know how many. He knew all the personalities. He got intimately involved with the people of the region, and their suffering was his suffering.
He spent a lot of holidays, Christmas time and Easter, going off to Bosnia. So one part of me goes, you know, why are you going into the war zone? And, you know, time at home is precious. But another part of me is very proud.
We're talking at a time of the 50th remembrance of the Holocaust. I guess I would ask again and still, and I guess I will always ask, what does never again mean if it does not mean never again?
To many of us, Frank is just beginning to reach his stride in politics. We know that this election was not a closed door, but perhaps an opening for something in the future. There's just too much talent there, too much ability, too many friends for him to not continue in politics in some capacity. And I'm just looking forward to the next McCloskey campaign.
Great job, Chris. We appreciate that very much. Ted Najum was one of the first people Frank picked to work with him in the mayor's office. And he's going to roll the clock back a little bit and remind us of some of the things they had to deal with. Ted is now a judge with the Indiana Court of Appeals.
When this event was being organized, I drew the short straw and got to go after Chris Sauter's video. Roberta, Mark, Helen, friends of Frank McCloskey, one and all. The 1971 Bloomington City election was a watershed event. It was our city's most significant election in the 20th century. That election began a process that transformed the face of local government and the quality of life throughout our community. Many people helped make that happen, but Frank McCloskey was the unrelenting and tireless catalyst for it. Frank touched my life and the lives of many people. He was intelligent, talented, compassionate, courageous, and thoroughly dedicated to improving the lives of others. We are all better because he lived, and we are all better because we knew him. And I openly confess that I am finding it very difficult to believe that Frank is gone. Since November 2nd, there have been a number of excellent written commentaries on the significance of Frank's life, including articles by Brian Hassler, Bill Wiggins, Greg Dawson, Kurt Vanderdusen, and Charlotte Zitlow, as well as the editorial written by Bob Salzberg in the Herald Times. These articles have spoken eloquently of Frank's courage, his humanity, and his achievements in public service in our city and beyond. It was my privilege to serve for 2 years as administrative assistant to the mayor in the first McCloskey administration. Many of you are as well or even better qualified than I am to recount the unselfish life of Frank McCloskey. I am grateful for this opportunity to celebrate Frank's life with you and to say a few words about Frank the Mayor, just a small sample from the whole. Let's go back to the fall of 1971. In late October, I had returned to Bloomington from law school for homecoming at Indiana University. On Friday night, I entered a sorority to pick up my date and found Frank McCloskey and Jack Hooker in the living room. I stayed to watch the debate. I had never met Frank before, although I always voted absentee. And this chance encounter would change the direction of my life. After the debate, he approached me and introduced himself. He stated with quiet confidence, "I'm going to win this election." He then asked me whether, after I finished law school, I would consider returning to Bloomington to join his administration. I replied immediately that I would, and we agreed that we would meet after the election. The campaign slogan was, "There is a better way." The preamble to the platform declared the campaign's basic theme that local government needed to be revitalized and that greater participation and involvement by all members of the community was essential. The platform was ambitious. It addressed 17 issues: planning, traffic, transportation, environment, annexation, housing, parks and recreation, annexation, taxation, economic development, city-county cooperation, drug control, police protection, fire protection, patronage, accessibility, democratic involvement, and administrative effectiveness. As Charlotte Zitlow noted in her recent guest column in the Herald Times, the agenda laid out in the campaign was methodically carried out in the ensuing years. And it cannot be said any better than our late friend and former city attorney Bill Finch said in the Recounting the Years video which we have just seen. Bloomington, what it is, where it has come, and where it is going was fundamentally shaped by Frank's terms as mayor. He either did them or planted the seeds for them. Now, the day before the election, Monroe County Clerk Eleanor Jamie Murphy predicted that 12,000 voters would turn out for the city election. In the end, 11,839 votes were cast for the office of mayor, the largest voter turnout in the city's history. Jamie's estimate was off by only 161 votes, or 1.3%. The then Monroe County Democratic Chairman, Ed Tracy, had predicted a 2,000 vote margin in the mayor's race. But Frank was more precise and just as accurate as Jamie. The night before the election, Frank predicted he would win the mayor's race by 2,529 votes. He won by 2,563 votes. He was off by only 34 votes, 1.3%. Frank won by almost 61%, the old-fashioned way. He and his supporters identified their voters, registered their voters, and got their voters to the polls. On election night, normally modest Frank declared, "We had the best organization going, the precinct machine was excellent, and we had one of the best registration efforts ever in the state and maybe in the nation." Now, because of the recently enacted 26th Amendment, which had given 18-year-olds the right to vote, the campaign took on national significance. It was covered by the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and NBC News. No one knew what impact the student vote might have. Student body president Mary Cyphers had endorsed Frank, and he came out of the so-called student precincts with a margin of 1,300 votes. But as both the Herald Telephone and that other newspaper, the New York Times, reported accurately, the student vote did not win the election. Frank carried 14 of the city's 16 precincts. On election night, Frank told his supporters, "I have no speech, nothing like that. Now I ask you, how many times have we heard Frank begin a speech by saying he had no speech? Frank identified quality city planning, accountability, and accessibility as the issues that had driven voters to the polls in record numbers. He declared, "The mayor must be an accessible leader, and I'm going to be a mayor who is there to talk to you day in and day out." Frank concluded his remarks while standing on a ladder with the following words: "There are so many people to thank, but I would like to thank my wife, Roberta. Considering she almost passed out when I decided to run last spring, she has come a long way." The campaign had energized many citizens in all walks of life. The people of Bloomington were thirsty to participate in policy making and in the governance of their city, and the McCloskey administration erected a large tent for people to assemble and be heard, and inside that tent there was a big table, and at times it seemed that almost everyone in Bloomington was seating at that table. The new Common Council contained 8 Democrats and Jack Morrison, the only incumbent Republican who had survived the election. They were Wayne Fix, Brian DeSanquois, Dick Behan, councilman at large. The other winners were Jim Ackerman, Hubert Davis, Al Towle, Sherwin Mizell, and Charlotte Zitlow, the first woman elected to the Common Council. And the council was intent on playing an active role in every aspect of the city's life. The Common Council and the first McCloskey administration pioneered the endless meeting. Council meetings would routinely go on into the early hours of the morning. Some of these meetings were contentious. "City Council decorum hits new low" was the Herald telephone headline describing one meeting that took place exactly 30 years ago today on November 15th, 1973. But both Frank and the council had declared during the campaign that the mayor and the members of the city council should be available to citizens, that closed doors should be opened, and the council will make decisions in open meetings. And although it was sometimes messy, Frank and the council kept that pledge. In so doing, they established a culture of openness and citizen participation that transformed the political culture of our city for the better. Frank reached in all directions for advice and support. He established a full-time city legal department. He kept his commitment to establish a city bus system and applied for a grant from UMTA, the Urban Mass Transit Authority. Frank then asked fine arts professor Tom Coleman to design the BT logo for Bloomington Transit that we still see today on the city's buses. Frank reached far and wide for his staff and for members of boards and commissions. He named lifetime Monroe County residents Jim Ray as Director of Transportation, Martha Sims as Controller, and Tobias Eagleson, one of Bloomington's early African-American leaders, to the Board of Public Works. He saw participation by the business and professional community, naming Dick Schmaltz to the Redevelopment Commission and Dr. Frank Chrismalis to the Board of Works. His first city engineer, Rasul Istrabadi, was from Iraq. And he made strategic Republican appointments, including Kenneth Ruppel to the Board of Public Safety and Jay Ellis to the Parks Board. Frank's first year in office, 1972, coincided with the creation of the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. This was a happy and timely coincidence. As Mayor Allison notes in the video that we have just seen, one of Frank's hallmarks as mayor was that he moved city government from a casual small-town operation into the modern era of public administration. Frank had excellent rapport with Chuck Bonser, the founder and first dean of the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. And in the mayor's office, we supervised the first group of SPIA interns for academic credit. We had 12 student interns working on various projects, collecting information and writing reports on various issues. And in 1972, I remember that Frank and I were on a short trip when he reached for the telephone, the car telephone. We didn't have cell phones then. You had to call the operator, and the operator would place the call for you. And he called to remind Jamie Murphy to place the referendum to establish a utilities service board on the election ballot. The Utilities Department had been a piggy bank for non-utility related expenditures and projects, and Frank was determined to separate utilities administration from the tax-based civil city. Because Frank had no prior experience in government, even his supporters did not know how things would turn out. At the end of Frank's first year in office, in late December 1972, Mark Akers, who covered City Hall for the Herald-Telephone, wrote, "If McCloskey has done nothing else in his first year as mayor, he has brought Bloomington out of the era of small-town government and into an era of professional urban administration." And while the Herald-Telephone never hesitated to criticize the city administration, in a December editorial in 1972, the paper concluded that it's becoming increasingly evident that the youthful mayor has come of age and has taken a firm grip on the controls that operate the machinery that can keep Bloomington moving ahead. He has survived his rookie season with a late surge of political and administrative prowess that enhanced his leadership position going into the new year. And then the editorial said, McCloskey is emerging as a mayor for all of Bloomington. Frank reminded us in the video that his administration had started or had improved upon the ambulance service. But it was 30 years before Frank himself would use the ambulance for his last trip to the hospital. While Frank was mayor, he announced that Bloomington would have a 911 emergency telephone system. This was only the 7th city in Indiana to have 911 and the first city in South Central Indiana. Both Frank and the council worked together and worked hard on many significant projects. Under Frank's leadership, Bloomington was one of the first Indiana cities to enact legislation under the 1971 Powers of Cities Act, commonly known as the Home Rule Act. Simply stated, Home Rule is the local power to govern without authority from the state. It was this Powers of Cities Act that provided the legal context for enactment of the Bloomington Landlord-Tenant Ordinance. Common Council adopted the ordinance on November 21st, 1972. There were 175 people at the meeting. Attorneys Frank Barnhart and John Irvin were there. John had been one of Frank's first assistants. The council asked the attorneys, Jimmy Regester and Larry Owens, for a legal opinion about what effect passing the ordinance would have. Both attorneys said that the ordinance was unlawful and wouldn't pass muster. Frank resolved the matter with a written memo which read as follows. The legal issues have never been tested under Public Law 250, and we are confronted with an honest difference of opinion as to the ordinance's legality. That difference of opinion cannot be resolved finally by the city of Bloomington, but almost certainly will be decided in the courts. I prefer to leave it to the courts. The ordinance passed by a vote of 6-2. The ordinance was challenged in the Monroe Circuit Court. Judge Nat Hill declared, as Larry Owens and Jimmy Regester had predicted, that a few provisions of the ordinance exceeded the city's powers, and Judge Hill was affirmed by the Court of Appeals. But most of the ordinance remained intact, and Bloomington led the way under the new Indiana Home Rule statute. Perhaps the most nettlesome problem that Frank confronted in his first term were the plans to install utilities in the Miller Drive neighborhood with federal funds from HUD's Neighborhood Development Program. The area had been annexed in 1969, and the neighborhood was badly divided, neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend, over the federal strings attached, which required that redevelopment accompany utility installation. The official Miller Drive Neighborhood Association was squared off against the rival Miller Drive Neighborhood Freedom Association, headed by Earl Polly. The issue demanded much of Frank's time and energy, and Jim Ackerman's time and energy, as that was his district. Frank loved this city, and he had a deep personal affection for its people. As has been noted, Frank was a reader and a thinker. He had both a vision for the future and appreciation for the current and past contributions of others. Frank was a man who had the courage of his convictions. He was guided by an internal compass. As he would address the decisions that confront every chief executive, he would often resolve the matter at hand by simply saying, "What is the right thing to do?" When I visited with Frank in early September, I remarked that when I had worked for him, it seemed that 3 out of 4 times, or about 75% of the time, his decisions were guided by instinct. Frank quickly replied with a twinkle in his eye, that more like 4 out of 5, or 80%. That'd be more accurate. Even with the burden of his illness, he was irrepressible. He wanted to quibble with me over 5%. Although this subject is outside the scope of my assignment, I would be remiss if I didn't say a word about Frank's heroic role in bringing about national and international attention to the atrocities and genocide in the Balkans. Twice, Frank recommended to me, and I recommend to each of you, as the gentleman did at the service earlier today, that you read A Problem from Hell by Samantha Power of Harvard's Kennedy School. The book won a Pulitzer Prize and accurately describes how Frank risked his political career in confronting the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and members of Congress with this issue. Frank was particularly proud, I think, of the people whom he inspired to enter and stay in public life, who, by way of illustration and not of limitation, would include John Goss, Vi Simpson, Betty Cockrum, and Jonathan Weinzapple, as well as many others. There was something that Frank did many years after he left the mayor's office and left Congress that illustrates his generous spirit and the depth of appreciation that he had for the worth of others. After Martha Ellen Sims died in December 1999, Frank wrote a letter to the editor to complain that her obituary fell far short of conveying the importance of her life in the Bloomington community. Frank wrote that Martha's passing ranked in local historical importance with the death several years before of Jimmy Regester, who was my first law partner. Frank wrote, "They were the builders, among the builders of Bloomington, the likes of which we may not see again." Frank concluded his 10-paragraph letter with the following words: "You could do worse than write a commemorative feature on her life. On the other hand, there's so much that can never be put in words." The same can be said of Frank. We can eulogize him, we can celebrate his life, but there is so much that can never be put in words.
Okay, Ted, we're up to 1974. That was good. No, that was just a snapshot, and for another snapshot, one of Frank's closest friends and advisors from down in Posey County. She's been a great friend of many people in the Democratic Party. I think she probably started with Birch Bayh, and she's ready for her next campaign every time I see her. Ann Greenfield.
I'm the fat lady in the video, but I promise I won't sing. That I've always been a little envious of those of you from Bloomington, because I knew that you knew Frank a lot longer than I did, and perhaps better than I did. And because I didn't get to know Frank, I didn't have the privilege of meeting Frank until 1982, when he and some John guy kept coming back and forth in the district, and he was determined that he was going to win the congressional race. Well, Joel Deckard was from Posey County, and I really, really liked this McCloskey guy from Bloomington, and the John guy too. And I thought, I looked at the polls, and I knew what they were saying. But you know how Frank had that way of jutting his chin out when he was determined, and he got that determined expression on his face, and he said, "I'm going to win this thing." Well, we grow big trees in Posey County. And he won that thing. And I think that I don't remember a congressman who even came close to Frank. I remember one time reading something that Sam Rayburn had written, and he said that a congressperson has done his or her job if he or she is able to make the federal government accessible to their constituents. And I thought by that criteria, Frank had certainly done his job. That and many other things. Now, when we were in the church and we were asked to think of a word that made us think about Frank, or the word that we thought was whispered to Frank when he was born, and I agreed with all of those that were said from all of you, even the one that said stubborn and never vote for a Republican. But the one that comes to mind for me is compassion, because I think this summed up his constituency work that was done while he was congressman. Now I know everybody, we all know this, that the congressman himself does not answer all those letters, and that they do not make all those phone calls to the Social Security office. It's staff, of course it is. But the congressman has to set the tone for the staff. First he has to choose the staff, and then he has to set that tone. It is difficult to get a letter answered from our present congressman. He does know constituent work. When I have people who ask about Social Security problems or anything of that nature, I tell them to contact their senator, because they try to contact their congressman, and he doesn't listen. But Frank listened. And I think that the two things that point this out, one thing, you know, Frank did have a good environmental record, and my friend Sandra Elpers told me on the way up here that at the time that she was battling breast cancer, the bill came up about breast cancer research with the giant U's. And of course this was a controversial thing. But Frank said, Sandra, I just kept thinking about you and I had to vote for it. And he did. And we think of all politicians talk about loving the people. And that's good. But Frank loved people, not just people. He loved the individual. And he looked at people not as the people, but as individual human beings who had problems and who had needs and who had things they needed to share. Another time that I think John was with him then, when we had a little fundraiser for him outside of a community that's as far removed from Bloomington as you could get in the 8th District as it was at that time. And it was almost in sight of the Wabash River in what is known as the Griffin Hills. And a Mumford family there has several thousand acres, and 3 or 4 of their children live and farm there. And this was an area that Frank had always thought was so beautiful, and truly it is. And so we had a little fundraiser up there on an afternoon, and a very enjoyable thing. And this man came over and said, Ann, do you think you could ask him if I could talk to him for a few minutes? And I said, well, of course. So I told Frank there was someone who needed to talk to him, and he made the time, of course, and they went over to a little concrete bench and sat down. And I had no idea what they were saying, but we got in the car to leave, and Frank said, that's not fair. That's just not fair. And he had big tears. And he said, this man's had 2 heart attacks. He's worked hard all his life. He can hardly walk across the room. And he's trying to get disability, and he's been turned down. And he needs help. And he said it's not fair for people to have to beg their government like that for something that they are entitled to. And he said, do you know that he bought a ticket to this fundraiser so that he could come talk to me? So it wasn't long after that, of course, so he naturally turned it over on Monday morning to the staff. And very quickly there was a hearing set up. And of course he is drawing disability today. And later his wife told me that about 2 weeks later they got a money order for the $25 for the ticket. And she wondered who had sent it, and I said, I know who sent it. But the Evansville Courier, we had a hard time getting any endorsements from the Evansville Courier, but the eulogy there for Frank was beautiful. And it began by saying that Frank was, perhaps they thought, too liberal for this district. And yet his work with the people and the things that he had done for this district were so good that people continued to reelect him. And then it went on to talk about Bosnia and how Frank did what he thought was right in Bosnia. And John and I were talking the other day, and he told me that Frank had called him before he asked for the Secretary of State's resignation. And I said, well, he called me too, and I don't know, I'm sure he called a lot of you. And I don't know what anybody else told him, but I know what John and I told him. We said, you know, you'll lose the election over this. You can't break with the administration like that. I mean, this is, you know, I know you feel strongly about this, but you can't ask for a Democrat Secretary of State's resignation without losing a lot of votes. And he said, and I have to do this. This is not, I don't have a choice. And this was the way Frank, when Frank felt strongly about something, as all of you know as well or better than I do, he had to do what he thought was right. I thought it was great that the editorial in the eulogy in the Courier ended up, the last line said he was one of the good guys. And he really was one of the good guys. He was our friend, and he was our congressman, and he was the best of the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Next, we have a little musical interlude. We have Andy Ruff from the City Council, who I'm told was Frank's favorite country and Western musician, and Mark Haggerty, who's a longtime Bloomington resident and avant-garde local musician. And one thing special about these two is they visited Frank in the hospital to cheer him up with music. And they're going to share a little bit of that with you.
Actually, my buddy Pete Conway and I are going to do one song, and then Mark's going to get up and play something. I'm not sure what. That'll be a surprise for me, too. Come on out, Pete. Is this mic on? Can't resist doing this, but since I got a chuckle earlier, I know Frank would not mind one bit. I promise. You know, the first interaction I ever had with Frank McCloskey was about 11 years ago, 12 years ago, and it was regarding I-69. I'm happy to say that With better information in hand and my persuasive powers, Frank eventually came around to seeing things my way, though the HT didn't want to accept that. So enough of the political commentary. You might wonder why this next song, The Long Black Veil, why here at this, to honor Frank? Well, the fact of the matter is Frank, in the last couple of years, he took up the guitar and he used to come over, because I'm not a guitar player. I'm not really a guitar player, but compared to Frank, I'm a guitar player. Okay, so he used to come over and he wanted to always play this song. Say, Andy, can we do Long Black Veil? Show me. I do Long Black Veil. And since, like I say, normally I'm not a guitar player, but with Frank, I got to play the little intro. Say, Frank, lay out. Don't come in until I do that little walk up to the G chord. So Frank, we're going to do this one more time. Came to the hospital and did the same. He wanted the same thing. We did it like 2 or 3 times one night. And he wanted it again. I said, Frank, we've already done the song several times. He said, well, do it for the nurse here. And I'm not sure how exactly appropriate it is, except other than the fact that I know Frank would want it, and he likes it. Frank, one more. I'll never do this song or hear this song again without thinking of him. Absolutely. I mean, we all will think of Frank when we think of social justice issues and leadership in so many areas, but I'll always think of him when I hear the Long Black Veil. You ready, Pete?
Years ago, on a cold, dark night, someone was killed 'neath the town hall lights. There were few at the scene, but they all agreed the man who ran looked a lot like me. The judge said, son, what is your alibi? If you were somewhere else, then you won't have to die. I spoke not a word, though it meant my life, for I had been in the arms of my best friend's wife. She walks these hills in a long black veil. She visits my grave when the night winds wail. Nobody knows, Lord, and nobody sees. Nobody knows but me. The scaffold is high and eternity is near. She stood in the crowd, Lord, but she shed not a tear. Oh, but sometimes at night, when the cold winds moan, in a long black veil, Lord, she cries o'er my bones. She walks these hills in a long black veil, visits my grave. when the night winds wail. Nobody knows, Lord, nobody sees, nobody knows me. Nobody knows but me. Thanks very much. I've got a little song to sing you, and afterward I'd like to tell a little story about Frank. Now, I'm an old friend of Frank's, and Frank was a friend of my dog, and a friend of my dad, too. My father taught me to play guitar, and Frank was a guitar player, too. And his son is named Mark, and Mark's a guitar player, too. 5 years ago, I buried my father where he wanted, next to his home and alongside his dog, who had died a couple years before. So when Frank was ill, I helped to take care of his dog, Chelsea, who is a beagleoid. And one day, while I was there, Chelsea had a dream, and she told it to me, so don't blame me. But it went kind of like this. This mic woke? Oh, good. Here we go. Well, I had a little dog that had a little dog that had a little dog that had a little dog. Well, the first little dog, well, he wasn't that bad, but that wasn't the only dog we had. Well, the first little dog had fleas and ticks, and he barked all night just for kicks. But the first little dog, well, he wasn't that bad, but that wasn't the only dog we had. Well, I had a little dog that had a little dog that had a little dog that had a little dog. Well, the second little dog was a whole lot worse. Well, he chewed tobacco and he learned to curse. Well, he ran down little kids on their cute little bikes, and he bit up the losers in tomcat fights. But the second little dog, well, he wasn't that bad, but that wasn't the only dog we had. Well, I had a little dog that had a little dog that had a little dog that had a little dog. Well, the third little dog was a whole lot badder. Well, he'd drink all day just to fill his bladder. Then he'd pee on people that had tried to pet him, just to try to make a bad impression. But the third little dog, well, he wasn't that bad, but that wasn't the only dog we had. dog that had a little dog that had a little dog that had a little dog. Well, the fourth little dog was the worst of all. Well, he chewed up the carpet and he burned down the mall. He played rap dog cussing on a CD player, and he stole $10 and he run for mayor. Well, he won that election, but here's what's sad. He's the best damn mayor that we ever had. Well, I had a little dog that had a little dog, had a little dog that had a little dog. Thank you. Now, I've got a short story here to talk about, talking about Frank here. I'm not a religious man, so please let me quote the Bible to you. In the Gospel of Matthew 10:34, Jesus says, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." Well, my name is Haggerty, and I come from around here. My father's home was just north of here and to the east of Martinsville. Frank was about 10 years older than me. My dad is about 15 years older than Frank. They both graduated from the IU School of Law. They both served as Democratic Party chairmen of their respective counties. Now, when my dad grew up in the 30s, that was Klan country. And with a name like Haggerty, he was suspected of being Irish Catholic. And the Klan hated Catholics. So I always thought that was why he became an advocate for civil rights and was elected to the legislature in the 50s after serving in World War II. As a teenager during the 60s, I was privileged to attend the Democratic National Convention with him when he was a delegate. And when I got back from Vietnam in 1969, I came to Bloomington, to IU as a student, and that was where I met Frank McCloskey. Frank was running for the legislature then. I was asked to run for precinct committeeman, and I did. And while I was committeeman on campus, the 18-year-old vote came through. And Frank ran for mayor as an anti-war candidate. It was not that close a race. In retrospect, at the time, we thought it was. And we registered people as well as we could. And we had a lot of students that lived off campus. But my precinct was campus. And it was a time, I like to think that these students that we registered helped him win this election against a pro-war Republican candidate. It was a time of great struggle. I remember seeing Frank in the anti-war demonstrations in front of Bryan Hall and the law school. And the Bloomington police and the county police and the state police and the IU police, all dressed in riot gear, marching from the south end of Indiana and 3rd into the protesters and arresting people. I myself was arrested later during my responsibilities as precinct committeeman on election day at the polling place I was responsible for, at the IU auditorium. I was arrested by the IU police for telling the police that they could not tear down Impeach Nixon signs legally placed at the polls. Later, I was arrested again by the IU police for another demonstration, and when I was taken to jail, marijuana was planted on me inside the jail. I was tried in court, and David Coleman came to my rescue. He defended me in court for free because he knew I was set up. Later, Frank was set up by the police to be busted at a party he was supposed to attend as a candidate where marijuana was present. Now, Frank didn't attend that party that night, but I've often wondered how his fate and the fate of this city would have been changed if he had. He probably would not have been elected to Congress to serve us. Westinghouse may not have been sued by his administration for dumping PCBs here, and his long and distinguished career could well have been ruined. Now, when my dad was dying of AIDS, he planted a little pot in his garden to ease his suffering, and before he could reap any benefit, the police came and pulled it all up and took him to the county jail. He almost died there, but a few months later he escaped them. As they pursued him through the courts, he died.
The last words he said to me were, "Mark, never let the sons of bitches get you down." This kind of struggle continues now. Last summer, I sat with Frank at a fundraiser to help defray Scott Wells' legal expenses related to his setup, beat up, and cover up by the radical right wing of the Republican Party and the state police. He spoke to the crowd there, and I want to end now by respecting his words. He said, "We can't let these sons of bitches get away with it." And we can't. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Next, we're going to shift the focus a little bit away from here in the 8th District. And I know Frank said to me, my best friend in Congress is Joe Long. Joe Long Thompson.
Thank you very much. I am extremely honored to be here because I believe to know Frank and Roberta McCloskey is to love them. They are two of the most giving, kindest people I have known in my 51 years on earth. And Frank was my very best friend in Congress, and I often remember a more senior member of Congress telling me right after I was elected that I should never forget, and he was referring to the franking privilege, I should never forget that my best friend was the Frank. And I said, well, actually, my best friend is the Frank. It's Frank McCloskey. And there are many reasons why Frank became my best friend, but I remember back in 1986 when I was running for the United States Senate, and not too many people even remember that I ran in that race, and I was getting ready to speak at a labor hall in Evansville. And I was very, very nervous. And Frank came over to me and he said, he was there and he was campaigning, and he said, "Now don't get nervous, Jill." He said, "It's not that big a deal." He said, "Now it's a big deal because it's the United States Senate, but it's not that big a deal. Just relax." And I thought that was very kind for somebody who had his own campaign and many things on his mind. But also, when I was running in 1988 in the 4th District, he drove all the way from Evansville to Fort Wayne and back to Bloomington to be at an event for me for 1 hour. It was one of those hot dog and baked bean picnics. And for somebody in our congressional delegation to make that kind of effort for somebody who was running in a very, very difficult race, I have never, ever forgotten it. But there are so many wonderful stories that you can tell about Frank McCloskey because he was a very complex man, a very giving man, a very talented, a deep-thinking man. One of my very favorite stories, however, is a story about when I was in Congress. I went up to Frank and I said, "Frank, I have not gone out on a date in a long time." And I said, "I don't know what's happened, but ever since I've been elected, nobody's asking me out." So Frank took it upon himself to fix me up with an Air Force officer half my age. Now, I've tried not to remember too much about that whole set of circumstances, but I remember two things. One, he was very fit, and the other was he called me ma'am. And that's the truth. But also, Frank was so kind. I remember a story about him that he was out for dinner with a number of members of Congress, and on his way back to the Hill, somebody who was homeless asked him for some money, and instead of just giving him some money, he worked to help the man find a job and to become independent. And that's the kind of person that Frank McCloskey was. But he, in addition to being such a kind person and so considerate and compassionate about individuals, he was very rare in that he had the ability to be an international leader on issues that really matter to us as the human race, as part of the human race. There aren't very many people who can look back on their career and say, I was good to individuals and I cared about individuals, but I made a mark internationally, and Frank McCloskey did that. And I think he did it because he understood that we can't ever settle for second best, whether it's in your personal life or what you do professionally. And if there is a charge to all of us as his friends, and we are just a fraction of the friends that Frank and Roberta McCloskey have had and have today. But if there is a charge to us, it's that we cannot settle. When we see things that are being done wrong and we see things being undone and not done, we have that responsibility to go out and make sure that we give every bit of effort that we can to make changes in our world, because ultimately that's why we're put on earth. And I think Frank McCloskey understood that. He represented our state and he represented people so well, and it really has been an honor to call him my best friend in Congress. Thank you.
Frank loved Congress very much and told me great stories about his experience in Congress before I actually got elected to Congress. I like Congress very much as well, except for the fact that there are too many right-wingers in one place. On this video that you're about to see, I don't know if Frank Wolf is going to be one of the presenters, but I always thought that Frank Wolf was a right-winger, and I still believe that he is. But he went to the podium in the halls of Congress in the House of Representatives as we were passing this resolution to name the post office in Bloomington, Indiana, the Frank McCloskey Post Office, and really gave a wonderful, heartfelt speech about Frank McCloskey, I'm sorry. Frank had a lot of friends in Congress. There were many people that wanted to speak on this resolution that created this post office after his name. So many, in fact, that we had to turn down literally dozens of people because we only had 1 hour. But I think that you're going to watch this video and it will touch your heart, it touched mine, to see the people march up to the podium to honor Frank McCloskey for the man that he was. So let's play the video. Oh, by the way, before I go down, I understand this is a short version. I have a longer version of the entire proceeding. I'm not going to play that here tonight, but I wanted to make sure that Roberta had the pleasure of seeing all the fine people march through to the podium to honor Frank McCloskey.
H.R. 3379 designates the facility of the United States Postal Service located at 3210 East 10th Street, Bloomington, Indiana, as the Francis Eck McCloskey Post Office Building. Congressman Frank McCloskey, a six-term representative from Indiana, sadly passed away at age 64 on Sunday, November 2nd, 2003. Frank was an extraordinarily caring individual, tremendously hardworking, a gentleman, and a very effective member of Congress. Mr. Speaker, he was a devoted member of this body with whom many of us served, and we are all saddened to hear that he had passed away on Sunday and are grateful for the opportunity to remember him here today.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to pay tribute to an old friend and dear colleague. Frank McCloskey and I came to Congress together in 1983, and for all the time that he served here, we sat beside each other on the Armed Services Committee. I enjoyed him as a person. I became a good friend. I admired him as a colleague, and I learned a lot from him. Frank was plain and unpretentious, but beneath a serious and even studious sort of demeanor, he was passionate about the things that he believed in and dogged in their pursuit. He stayed on top of the issues. We get confronted continually with issues of all sorts. I'll never forget the morning after Reagan made his SDI speech, March 1983. Frank was the one member of the committee then who was probing the Defense Department witnesses about strategic defense. He was skeptical, but he was always informed and diligent and fair-minded as a critic. Long before Srebrenica, he was troubled, deeply personally conflicted about the war and carnage in the Balkans, and he was an early advocate and a lonely supporter of our intervention there. There were those who said it was not possible, it was not feasible, it was not desirable, but in the long run, Frank McCloskey's position was vindicated.
Mr. Speaker, I want to join my colleagues in asking all of the House to support this resolution on behalf of a great American, a true Hoosier, and an outstanding public servant, that is the former Indiana Congressman Frank McCloskey. Frank devoted his life to serving people, whether it was in the military service of our country, whether it was as a mayor, or whether it was as a member of Congress, or subsequently a private citizen. Frank, as several of the speakers have already mentioned, was a man of great passion over those things that matter to him and those things that matter to people who could least defend and protect themselves. Frank McCloskey was a noble man, engaged in noble work, and he was a man of courage. Mr. Hill mentioned that he was courageous to the last breath that he took. He was always courageous in the words he spoke, in the actions he took in the House of Representatives. Frank did come to Congress in 1983, and he served his district with distinction for 12 years. He was passionate about helping working families, their children, and their parents. It's also said, and it's certainly true, that Frank was as much home in the coal mines of southern Indiana as he was in the halls of Congress. Frank authored legislation for children to make sure that companies could not send free samples of drugs or cleaning products through the mail without child safety caps. In 1990, he authored other legislation against deceptive practices. But subsequent to his public service in the United States Congress, he acted perhaps most nobly when he took that great interest in humanitarian issues worldwide. He was one of the first U.S. public servants to visit Bosnia when it was embroiled in warfare and ethnic cleansing. He successfully brought the suffering to the attention of the American people, our government, and championed humanitarian intervention, and he continued that work throughout his life. In 2002, last year, Frank was named director of the Kosovo programs for the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, where he taught other leaders from around the globe how to govern democratically. I would close again by reflecting on Mr. McCloskey's courage of his conviction, of his life, and of his commitment to everyone.
Mr. Speaker, it's with great personal sadness that I rise to pay tribute to Frank McCloskey, who passed away on Sunday, surrounded by family and friends. And that's exactly how he lived, surrounded by family and friends. Frank was a respected colleague in this body, a dear friend, and a faithful public servant for the people of Indiana. He was the mayor of Bloomington, as has been said, for 10 years. A very young man. He was just out of law school when he was elected mayor of Bloomington, and he was always in touch with his district. He was so proud to represent Indiana in the Congress, and those of us who served with him learned from him every single day about the wonders of Indiana and about the prospects for our great country. Frank was a fighter, a gentleman, a diplomatic, a lovely and gracious man, but a fighter. He believed in causes greater than himself, and he worked tirelessly to achieve them. Anyone who served in Congress with Frank knew that once he grabbed hold of an idea, he did not let go. In his work on the Armed Services Committee and Foreign Affairs Committee, Frank knew that our highest priority as members of Congress was to provide for the common defense. He honored that commitment and became an expert on national defense policy. Frank was passionate and eloquent in his support for the people of Bosnia and a leader in stopping the genocide there. What a source of pride that must have been to him. Mr. Shea is shaking his head, acknowledging such a champion for human rights and respecting the dignity and worth of every person. He cared deeply for the people of Bosnia and refused to believe that the United States could not stop the atrocities occurring there. On this, as with so many other issues, Frank was ahead of his time. Thank you again, Congressman Hill, for your work to designate the Francis X. McCloskey Post Office. As we all know, Frank served on the Post Office and Civil Service Committee, and how proud, I know a source of great pride it is to have a post office named in his honor.
Mr. Speaker, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once remarked, "An individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity." Today, as we note the untimely passing on Sunday afternoon of our friend and former colleague, Indiana Congressman Frank McCloskey, who lost a year-long battle with cancer, let it long be remembered that this Hoosier embraced not only the important concerns of his constituents in southwest Indiana, but also the broader concerns of all humanity. In the early 90s, I worked very, very closely with Congressman McCloskey and others to call attention to the atrocities and ethnic cleansing perpetrated by Slobodan Milosevic and his henchmen in Bosnia. Many in the international community, indeed many in this country, looked away. Frank McCloskey did not. A fact-finding trip to Bosnia in 1991 stirred and galvanized Frank's passion. As a member of the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committees, Congressman McCloskey was among the first in Congress to call for airstrikes against Serbian positions in Bosnia-Herzegovina, from which Bosnians were being shelled and murdered. Frank urged that Milosevic be tried as a war criminal, which now, in fact, is happening. He and I worked to lift the arms embargo against Bosnia, and he was not shy about criticizing the Clinton administration when he disagreed with its handling of that conflict. Mr. Speaker, political expediency practically demanded that Frank McCloskey focus on shoring up his position in the 8th Congressional District. As is well known, he won his first election to this body in 1984 by 4 votes. But in spite of the fact that he won 6 congressional races in one of the most competitive districts in America, political calculation did not crowd out the humanity in Frank McCloskey's heart. He was commanded by conscience to do what he believed was right. Frank McCloskey lived a full life, serving in the Air Force, working as a newspaper reporter, and serving as Bloomington's mayor for 10 years before he was elected to this Congress. Let me close, Mr. Speaker, by quoting John Kennedy, who inspired Frank and inspired many of us in this body. Kennedy said this: "I believe in human dignity as the source of national purpose, human liberty as the source of national action, the human heart as the source of national compassion, and in the human mind as the source of our invention and our ideas." Mr. Speaker, those were words that Frank McCloskey lived by. We mourn his loss and offer our condolences to his wife of 30 years, Roberta, and his 2 children, Helen and Mark, as well as his family and many friends. Frank McCloskey made this a better body. He made this country better. We mourn his loss.
You know, I knew it was really important that we had to keep counting those ballots in '84 until Frank won. And I think one of the big reasons is so that he could be in a position to do what he did on the Bosnia and Kosovo situation. Our next 3 speakers have made a tremendous effort to get here from Washington, D.C. I'm sorry they had to wait so late on the program. From the Bosnian Embassy, Merceda Kolokovic, please come up.
Hello and good evening. I see always in the States they have a problem to pronounce my name. And my name is Mirsada Čolaković. I'm from Bosnian Embassy, and I'm here today on behalf of the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina, on behalf of the president, of the member of the presidency, Mr. Tihić, and to represent my embassy. It's very difficult for me to talk after all these distinguished speakers who know better Congressman McCloskey than me. I met him just once. It's difficult also to speak because all the time when someone talks about his career, they are mentioning Bosnia. That's why it's not easy for someone from Bosnia to express all feeling, all deep feeling, regrets, what we have, and all respect what we had for Congressman McCloskey. Because we got in the embassy and tried to choose what we have to present today, just to pay all our respect to the Congressman McCloskey, I choose two things for you. One is the message what we got from our president to the family of Congressman Frank McCloskey is very short and brief, and I will read to you just to show to you how much the people of Bosnia really still, they really feel about the loss of a congressman. It was the great regret that I learned of Congressman McCloskey passing. We share you profound grief and feeling that this is untimely death of the Honorable Frank McCloskey is not just an immense loss for you, his family, but also for people of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I am aware of the great contribution and impact that Congressman McCloskey's actions had on the United States of America's role during the war in Bosnia. His full-hearted and passionate approach will be always remembered and cherished by the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Sulejman Tihić, President of Bosnia and Herzegovina. That was his personal message. The second thing what I've the second thing what I will read for you, it's also the message of the ambassador, the first Bosnian ambassador who was serving here for Bosnia from 1994 till 1999 in the Washington, D.C., and he is now designating ambassador to the NATO and to the Belgium. He just left Washington, and he was really the friend of Congressman McCloskey. He promised, that's why I'm reading this letter, that in the case that Congressman McCloskey passed away, that he will come to his funeral. He was not able to come, and he sent this personal message that I read to his family, to his friends, and to the Americans. Dear Frank friends, it has been just a couple of weeks ago when I spoke with Frank over the phone. Although I knew he was in the hospital, I did not believe that Frank would leave us so soon. I was on my way to Bosnia when I learned the terrible news that Frank passed away. I arrived in Washington 10 years ago as ambassador of Bosnia in order to seek help for my country. Frank was already well known for his firm statement that the United States and the West must do something to stop aggression and genocide in Bosnia. He was calling for airstrikes, lifting the siege of Sarajevo, liberating concentration camps, and lifting the unjust arms embargo on the Latin people of Bosnia defending themselves. I knew so much about Frank's actions. Therefore, I was very eager to meet Frank immediately upon my arrival. And really, he was one of the first people that I met in Washington. I was very excited when I got a phone call from Melissa, his press secretary, to meet and have dinner in restaurant La Colline. My excitement was so great that I arrived even 15 minutes earlier to make sure not to be late. Frank brought his dream team along with him, Melissa, Melinda, Marshall, and Richard. That evening guided practically my activities during my tenure as ambassador. I still can hear his soft voice outlining what and how Western powers must act and act now to stop genocide and aggression in Bosnia and Croatia. Frank's sense and feeling what is right and what is wrong took him on this path not to fight for justice for underdog, and no wonder why Bosnia became his passion until the last moment of his life. When he was talking about these issues, he would stay firm on his principles regardless if that would harm him or not, if that was call for resignation of Secretary of State, Secretary of United States, or helping refugees in need expelled from their homes. His voice was heard and heard well across the Capitol Hill and White House and the State Department. Frank was champion for Bosnia at a time when some of his colleagues didn't know where Bosnia is. Since that first meeting, we went a long way. First task was to end the war and Dayton peace negotiation, then after that, rebuilding the war-torn country and difficult legal battle for District Brčko. His great expertise, knowledge, devotion, determination to fight for the right cause helped Bosnia to achieve peace and win legal battle for Brčko, where Frank played a vital role advising my government. We would meet very often to discuss policies and plan actions at many places, but particularly Irish pub Dubliner was our favorite. Beside a lot of politics, there was this proud Irish spirit which was charging our batteries in a moment when the things were not going so well. Frank fell in love with Bosnia at first sight. He would use every opportunity to help people of Bosnia. He passed that love to his son and wife, so that became the issue in the McCloskey home. Frank even sent his son to work in Bosnia and to help its people. Frank visited Bosnia a number of times. We would plan these trips together. But one of these trips I remember particularly well, when I expected him to come to Bosnia after the war. That was during the Easter of 1997. The city was still in ruins, but Easter was celebrated by big mass in Sarajevo Cathedral. I knew that Frank is in Sarajevo. I knew where to find him, so I called him and we went that Easter Saturday to the Mass. After the Mass, people start greeting Frank, hugging him and thanking him, telling him that he is their hero. Christiane Amanpour saw a big crowd and recognized Frank and asked him to say a few words. His words, said then on the sunny Easter Sunday morning, are still reasoning in my ears. These people in Bosnia suffered so much, lost their loved ones. They are ones to be praised, recognized, greeted. They are true heroes. I did what one of us would and should do. That was my Frank, and I believe yours as well, because Frank was so simply straightforward and honest to the bone. He was always what he was. Therefore, I'm proudly wearing T-shirts from his political campaign with inscription, Frank's friend. Therefore, I'm proud to be called Frank's friend. My thoughts and prayers are with him, and God bless his soul. Sven Alkalai, the ambassador. I will not take your time anymore too much, and plus I have to go back to Washington. I just have to tell you all day yesterday I was driving from Washington to Indiana. I thought all the time about Mr. McCloskey. I thought, what pushed this man from this far away, I mean, when you are driving, you see how far is Indiana, to so straight and all the time fight for my country. I'm Sarajevo girl. I'm one of the person who in 1991 and 1992 was turning and trying to find some light in the darkness of Europe, because they closed their eyes on what's going on there. And we found some of the light, like it was Frank McCloskey. I can only say one word in my language on the end. I know that some of you will understand that. Frank, hvala za sve što si učinio za Bosnu. Hvala još jedan put. Thank you.
Next, from the National Democratic Institute, who Frank continued to work with up through this past year, Renee Trakova.
It is indeed very difficult to stand here after all of those distinguished guests that paid tribute to Frank's life, and I'm honored to be one of those people. I'm honored to have been Frank's friend, and I'm honored to represent the National Democratic Institute today, and thank him for all of the wonderful things that he has done and contributed towards the democratization efforts in Central and Eastern Europe. I would like to read a letter again from our chairman of the National Democratic Institute, Madeleine Albright, and also from Kenneth Wallach, who is the president of the National Democratic Institute. We were very fortunate to count Frank as a member of NDI's family. The time, energy, and dedication that he provided to the Institute and the values of justice, human dignity, and peace that he espoused have left an indelible mark on NDI's partners in Bosnia, Kosovo, and elsewhere. As you well know, Frank was a tireless proponent of democracy, and while in Congress and in the Balkans, labored long hours to see that people recovering from the horrors of war had a real opportunity to rebuild their lives and communities. They were, in a sense, Frank's constituents, and he worked to do right by them in the same way that he worked for the people of Bloomington and the 8th District. He made a real difference in people's lives. Frank combined political savvy, a thirst for knowledge, and human compassion, qualities so rarely exhibited so completely by one individual. Perhaps most important was Frank's impact on a personal level. Everyone at the National Democratic Institute, and particularly our Bosnia and Kosovo teams, enjoyed being in his company. He made people comfortable, putting them at ease in difficult working environments. Frank was particularly valued by our junior staff, who looked to him as a mentor. He spoke about human dignity and decency, and he led by example. We want you to know how much Frank is cherished by this organization and by the many people whose lives he touched through the National Democratic Institute. We join you, your family, your friends, and all of America in commemorating Frank's remarkable life. He was a wonderful man, and NDI will always honor his many contributions. Sincerely, Madeleine Albright and Kenneth Wallach. Very quickly, because I know that we're probably running short on time, but very, very quickly on a personal level, I just want to say that I met and I've known Frank as first as my classmate, and that is actually why I admire Frank so much. Because when I started as a student, he was a graduate student at the Russian and East European Institute at Indiana University, the furthest thing from my mind was that I would actually sit in a classroom with a former congressman, a mayor, such a distinguished man, with such an accomplished career, and he would be my classmate, and he would be sweating over our history papers together, whether he would be sitting and talking about our grades, and he would be sharing how he thinks that he unjustly got a B+ and how he should have gotten an A. So. I think it speaks, it touches the heart of really who Frank was. I know I have known him as a classmate. Of course, I was intimidated initially because I was a graduate student, and I could learn so much from a person with his distinguished career and so many accomplishments. And here he was sitting next to me. And we were sitting I could remember we were sitting in coffee shops every week and talking about political events internationally and also domestically. And every now and then I would stop and I would think to myself, I'm talking to a person that has such a distinguished career, and he's treating me just like he would treat anybody else. He could talk to the president of Bosnia, he could be in high-level negotiations, and yet he also had a way of relating to everyday people. You know, he was a great mentor, he was a great friend, and he would be greatly missed. And also, he was a great mentor not only to myself, but also to many people, as mentioned in the letter by our chairman, Madeleine Albright, in the Institute, and also in our field offices. Today with me, we have Anissa Wanat, who is our program manager for our Kosovo program, and as most of you know, Frank was shortly the country director of that program, courageously promoting and contributing towards the democratization efforts in Kosovo as well. And I have a letter here, it's very short, from one of the people who worked with Frank. His name is Eddie Efendija. His English is not very good, but please bear with me. I was very sad to hear the news that Frank passed away. I had the honor and pleasure to work closely with Frank during his stay in Kosovo. We were all impressed with Frank's commitment to help Kosovo people. Despite his health difficulties that occurred, Frank seemed to be determined to continue with his work here. That touched us all. In my eyes, that is what Frank was all about, helping people that he believed need him. If I were to describe Frank in one sentence, I'd say he was not against anybody, but he was very much pro-justice among people. At least this is how I will always remember Frank. And with that, I would like to end, and I would like to say that I'm honored to have been Frank's classmate and Frank's colleague and Frank's friend.
Thank you, Renee. Next, Richard Johnson, who was at the State Department during a very critical period on all the decision-making and was Frank's policy advisor. And I think he had a very unique viewpoint on what was happening, and wanted to make a special trip out here to join us today.
I'd like first to thank Roberta, who saw me earlier today and asked me to join the list of speakers. I feel tremendously honored to be among this group of people. I can speak to Frank's work in the Congress in '92 and '93 on the Bosnia issue, and I think in doing so I can speak for a lot of the other dissident Foreign Service officers from the State Department who were desperately looking for ways to get our government to move back in those days. Frank, for us, was a real beacon of hope. I had been the Yugoslav desk officer from '90 to '92. That was the end of my assignment. I was looking what else I could do. I was kind of in despair about getting the executive branch to do anything at the time, so I asked to be assigned to the Congress. And then I went to Frank's office and asked whether he would hire me on for a year as his foreign policy advisor, and he agreed to. And that was a wonderful thing in my life. It gave me another year of hope. All of us in the State Department really deeply, deeply admired his vision, the fact that he was able to see what was going on there clearly, that he was willing to tell the story honestly to the American people, and that he was willing to push the administration, regardless of political expediency and calculation, to do the right thing. It really made a difference for, dozens of young Foreign Service officers, mid-level officers who were desperate for someone to be doing something. Our own hierarchy wasn't doing anything, so to look to people like Frank was a great hope for us. I can speak also as someone who was with Frank in Congress in those times about how, when I watched him work the Congress on this issue, he was constantly, for example, buttonholing fellow congressmen in hallways and talking to them about Bosnia. It was pretty rare that any of these other congressmen really wanted to listen to that story, but they always did listen because of Frank's human qualities and who they knew he was. And not only did they listen, but he had an impact because of his human qualities. And I really think that the person Frank was allowed him to move the Congress in the right direction in those days. Finally, I can speak a little bit also to how Bosnians perceived Frank's work in those days. I know that there was a young Bosnian woman who escaped from Sarajevo in November '92, had reached the United States and was working as a grassroots activist trying to mobilize American support for Bosnia. She was working up in Massachusetts. And when she heard about Frank's statements and read them, some of his speeches, she told her roommate at Mount Holyoke College that she was going to go down to Washington and elope with this man. Well, she came down and met Frank and learned that he was happily married. But I was also in the room, and she is now my wife. So, Finally, I just want to add that those were very dark and depressing times for all of those who were working that issue in Washington. But in Frank's office and in the circle of people who were working with Frank on the Bosnia issue, we were very somehow, I can't say cheerful, but we were very happy. And it wasn't a depressing time for us in the sense that we really felt that we were part of a team that was doing the right thing, that was having an impact. And I look back on those days with tremendous heart. Thank you.
Next, we have a special treat, Professor Emeritus Eugene Rousseau, who I understand was once a member of Woody Herman's band. He's going to come up and treat us to Stardust.
I think it's especially fitting to play Stardust for a couple reasons. Frank McCloskey, as we all know and have all heard, loved Bloomington. Hoagie Carmichael loved Bloomington too. And this tune, as you know, most of you know, was written just a few blocks from here. And it has more meaning than just Bloomington. It has an international meaning because it doesn't matter in which country I go, everyone knows Stardust. Frank loved it, and I'm happy to play it in his memory.
Next, we have Bloomington City Clerk and Democratic Vice Chair, who spent a lot of time with Frank in the last few years, Regina Moore.
After leaving Congress, Frank liked living and working in Washington, D.C. He liked working in Indianapolis. Frank liked working anywhere that he could chat with people, even if he didn't know their language. But he loved one place, Bloomington, Indiana, a place large enough for diversity, small enough for conviviality, an urban village that Frank helped create. And here, that love was and still is being returned many times over. Elsewhere, he may have been addressed by title, but here he was known simply as Frank. Frank at the bakehouse in the morning. Frank at Borders getting his New York Times. Lunch at Grazzi's or Tortilla Flat. Dinner, maybe Carmela's or La Torre. Opie's with the Saturday lunch bunch of post-congressional friends. The Uplands with some pre-congressional friends. Frank at the movies. Frank at concerts, outdoors, indoors. Where are the doodaddies playing? Frank at this benefit, Frank at that benefit. Frank loved the many great, good public places of Bloomington, and he frequented many of them. Daily, Frank was on the move, somewhere in town, listening to the stories of anyone who cared to share. And everyone's story was important to him and got his attention. He always remembered the stories, and most often, the tellers. Did Frank limit himself just to old friends or the important? Hardly. A stranger was but a friend he hadn't yet met. Get some certification and meet some interesting people? What a deal. So Frank takes college classes for credit. Former mayor, former congressman, what should they call him? Frank will do. Same with waitresses and waiters. Hi, I'm Frank. What's your name? People on the street? Hey, Frank. People in bars? Hey, Frank. People at the cinemas? Hey, Frank. Everywhere, all the time, hey, Frank. And Frank responding, hi, Tom. Hi, Jim. Hi, Nikki. Hi, Dave. Hi, Sue. Sometimes forgetting the name, sometimes drawing on Roberta's equally remarkable capacity for recalling names, occasionally asking them their name, but always remembering their story. Frank, that rarity in today's political world, a politician who genuinely liked people. And politician he was. Out of the office, so what? The local Democratic Party in '99 needed him to heal a split. Frank did, and contrary to all the predictions of the local pundits, we gained 1 seat on the city council, and we began the March on Ellettsville. Frank led the party, not by management skills, orations, or manipulations, but by moral authority grounded in friendship and respect. Frank recruiting and encouraging new candidates. Frank consoling defeated office seekers. Frank defining the Democratic agenda. Frank recruiting and allowing talented persons to have significant roles in party operations. Frank getting national luminaries such as Nancy Pelosi and Barney Frank and Birch Bayh to speak at our Jefferson Jackson dinners, free. Frank running towards and not away from Scott Wells, showing that he too was a bulldog when any Democrat was set up by political opponents. Frank held things together until 2002, when both the left wing and the right wing of the party thought each could fly without each other. Frank warned, Frank pleaded, but Frank at the time was fighting a more important fight. Howe's Frank then took on the place of any other greetings, so many cheering him on in his big fight. The unimaginable was reluctantly thought, Bloomington without Frank. No one wanted that, certainly not Frank. Frank didn't go out looking for a fight with this particular opponent. No, he thought he was going to enjoy a few months to a year in his beloved Bosnia, adding to his earlier peacemaking work. Frank envisioned Bloomington as his home base with assignments to various places in the world to work on peace missions and democratic institution building. Work like he did for several weeks in Kyrgyzstan in 2000. Around these assignments would be trips with friends to Italy, and Ireland and Scotland, and perhaps Mars if tourism had opened there. But the cough, noticeable as he boarded the plane for his last trip to Bosnia, got worse in 2002. Frank returns, must see doctors, discovers his opponent, and learns the contours of this ring that he must master. Whatever Frank gave us before this fight, he gave us even more during it. He gave us an example of how to face a cruel turn of fate and meet it with determination, resolve, and good humor. Frank still at the bakehouse with his language flashcards. Frank still at Tortilla Flat. Frank still at Grazzi's. Frank still at the multiplexes, plays concerts right here in this room at Lotus. Frank still practicing his guitar. Frank still giving counsel to immigrants and wayward Democrats. Frank still supping at the Feast of Life, daily convening a caucus of conviviality. Frank still meeting and remembering new people, touching bases with old friends, taking law classes in between radiation treatments, still losing his keys, misplacing his glasses. Frank still with left brain and right brain hardly talking to each other, but both busily engaged in conversation with others. Frank still gracing his beloved Bloomington with his unique blend of gravitas and goofiness. Statesman and ordinary guy, cosmopolitan and provincial, social animal and loner, teacher and learner. During his final year, Bloomington experienced anew the conundrum of Frank. His body was frailer, but the mind perhaps even sharper. Although it's been almost 2 weeks since Frank's spirit escaped its mortal constraints, I still feel his presence in downtown, in the neighborhood, on the streets, in City Hall, in the restaurants and taverns and cinemas. Small wonder, for Bloomington is Frank, and Frank is Bloomington at its very best. Thank you.
Well, we saved a special friend of Frank McCloskey to last. Pat Murphy, I know, drove Frank to his treatments, checked in on him virtually every day, kept the rest of his friends posted on how he was doing, and really was Frank's best friend at the end, I think. Pat?
It's kind of like, I feel like George Gobel when he came out on The Tonight Show, he made the comment that he feels like a brown pair of loafers with a black tuxedo. And having followed all these people, I know my audience and we're running late, so I'm going to try and cut things a little short. But just one more thing that John said. Frank had a lot of good friends. There were a lot of people there, and they all sit in this audience before me, and some of them aren't there, that were there to take care of him. So I'm just one of the lucky ones that got to speak. But I have to say thank you to all those that made my job easier and Regina's job easier, and of course the family. But let me say this. There's been a theme throughout all of Frank's life, and although his accomplishments are many, there's one constant that has existed in his life, and that constant has been Roberta and his family. Before Frank was a public servant, he was a husband, he was a father, and he was a brother. Frank was proud of his family. He loved them, and the reason that I know this is because Frank told me. Frank spoke often of his children, of Helen and Mark, and their skills and talents. He continually was regaling me with Helen's language skills, French, Spanish, Helen, and your dad always wanted you to make sure you finished that last paper, okay? And Mark has been looking for a job, and he actually talked to where I work and his skills as a writer. And Frank would talk about his kids, and he loved his children. And the reason I know that is because Frank told me. Frank also loved his brother Michael and his sister Pat. Frank, early on in our friendship, told me that, and excuse me for saying this, because if it's not right, I'm in deep doo-doo. Frank said to me, Pat, Roberta likes you. I hope that's the truth. So not only because of that was Frank my friend, but Roberta is my friend. With friendship comes trust. And Roberta trusted me, and Frank trusted me. Roberta might have trusted me too much. I think, as most of you know, or I don't know if you all know, I'm single, so I had a little more free time. I'm not single anymore. I'm not married, but that's another story. But I can remember, I can remember just within the last year, Regina talked about the upland. Well, I called Frank up, and I said, I think Roberta answered the phone. And I said, Roberta, is Frank around? I'd like to talk to him. Is it okay if we go out and get a beer? And she said, have you guys rehearsed this or what? Because evidently he was saying the same thing. So oftentimes we did things together, kind of more guy things, but also with Roberta. So, you know, through all the ups and downs of this life, of this wonderful life, the constant has been Roberta, and has been Mark, and has been Helen, and has been his love for them. And as I said before, and I'll say it again, I know that because Frank told me. I'm thankful for that trust, because that trust enabled me to be a part of this journey that we've been on that brings us to this point in time. Over the last 14 months, this journey for me has been a new experience in my life. I feel fortunate to have been involved in this journey along with many of you. But this journey was one that will never, ever leave me. Frank McCloskey was a brave man. Never once did I hear him complain. Never once did I hear him say, why me? Never once did he say, you know, why is my life like this? He never complained. He was a humble man in many respects, but in most respects, he was extremely courageous. I had the opportunity with many of you here to spend some time with him in the last couple weeks, 2, 3, 4 weeks of his life. And I think we assume that when people are in this transition, this movement of their souls and their body to another place, that there is a weakness, that those people are weak. Well, I discovered just the opposite, that I was weak, that I was learning from him, learning from his strength. And as I saw him in those moments before Frank moved on, I saw a courage and a strength and a wisdom within his soul. And I know that may sound, but I saw it. And what I saw was when Frank, I saw a glimpse of humanity. I saw the humanness of the human condition. I saw humanity, and I saw when someone is ready that there is this uniqueness that gave me a glimpse that people are good, and people are human, and people are compassionate. And I saw that in Frank early on in his life when I first met him in 1975, and at that moment when I got to say to him, I love you. Let me just say that the Irish believe in a land called Tir na Nog. And not much has been said about Frank and Irish in Ireland. And trust me, he was. He did a lot for Bosnia, but he was extremely concerned about the plight of the people of Northern Ireland. You'll see his picture with Roberta and John Hume, the Social Democratic Labor Party, who was a Nobel Prize winner, out front. Tir na Nog is the land of eternal youth. To Irish men and women of the 19th and 20th century. Well, first of all, Tir na Nog is also a land to the west, the far west. And to folks from Ireland in the 19th and 20th century, that meant one place, and that place is America. And that's why I'm standing here, although I am part German. And that's why Frank and a lot of us are here, the Joe Kernans, the Frank O'Bannons, the Brian O'Neills, everybody. But now, Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth. To me, when I think of Frank, I see someone, and I say this to Frank because I know that's the case, whose walk is strong, whose back is straight, whose hair is black, and whose lungs are clear, and he's just enjoying himself, and there's that impish grin on his face. We must resolve that when we ever say Frank's name, and we will say it often, Frank, Frank, that we have a smile on our face. I make that promise today that whenever I think of him, I will smile. He was my friend, and as I said then, and I say now, I loved him. Thank you.
McCloskey and his family, and Pat just talked about a smile. It's time to stand up. I want you to stand up. This is the end of the program. We're going to sing a song together that he loved and that speaks to the heritage. I'll introduce it. Our musicians are gone, but we'll do it okay.